Hello, everybody. I'm Kim Scott. Happy to be back here with you on the Radical Respect podcast.
And I'm Wesley Faulkner, her co-host, and we are opening the curtains on education today, which I'm really excited for because this is something that's really near and dear to my heart because education impacts us all and impacts people who are parents especially, which I am one. And so I would love to hear this banter. I'm really excited for this conversation. Kim, could you introduce our guest today?
Yeah, it is my great pleasure to welcome Shalini Shybut today. Shalini is an executive coach, a consultant, and an entrepreneur in Washington, D.C. Shalini started her career as a teacher in New York City and moved on to serve as a consultant to public and private sector organizations, a school system leader in DC's largest education funding organization. Across these experiences, Shalini has consistently worked to shift systems to increase equity of opportunity and outcomes for the most marginalized communities and empowered people and teams to get there. Currently, Shalini is an executive coach supporting leaders, especially leaders of color, at the most senior levels of mission-driven organizations in navigating complex systemic challenges, with a particular focus on how race, gender, and power play into leadership. She also established a leadership cohort for DC nonprofit CEOs who identify as people of color. Shalini, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation.
I've been looking forward to it all week. In fact, you wrote not too long ago an article that I really admired. So why don't you share with Wesley, who hasn't had a chance to read it yet, and with our listeners, what that was about, and then we'll chat about it because it was brilliant.
Sure. I have been spending a lot of my time more recently as an executive coach in DC. And I work predominantly with CEOs of nonprofits, mostly in the education space, who identify as people of color. I got into this work and I wrote this article because I have, the nonprofit sector, I think we've also seen it in the for-profit sector, has really moved to diversify leadership. People get into these roles who are leaders of color, or organizations are trying to get people into these roles. And the things I hear are, we can't find a leader who is qualified. This person is really struggling. Or I hear from leaders themselves, I just feel incredibly unsuccessful. And then they leave, which is a loss for everyone. There's research on that. And so I wrote this piece, which I called, How Do You Close the Entitlement Gap for Leaders of Color? Because I wanted to articulate that I think we're asking the wrong people to solve the wrong problem.
Yes. So say more about, I think I know what you mean, but explain that for folks.
So the word entitlement, if you look up the dictionary definition, it can be a right or it can be a privilege. And when you look at white leaders, one, they have the right to leadership through pathways. They may be put in the C-suite accelerator program. They get into business school. That's all of the stuff around the social inequities, around access. We've seen the research on who is in the C-suite. They also have the benefit of the positive expectation that they are going to succeed and other people think they are going to succeed, which is a rational expectation given what the data tells us.
Yeah.
When you look at leaders of color, they objectively do not have either of those things, neither the direct pathways to leadership, nor the expectation that they are going to succeed. And yet, what we keep trying to do is ask the leader to fix themselves instead of fixing the systems, which is what you do when you have inequities of rights and privileges, right? We say that person we need to do some capacity building. That's really popular in the philanthropic world. That person should go look for a peer or a mentor to help them not quit their job. They need to learn how to do these things the way that they are expected. So I think, one, I think it's the wrong answer. We are losing the incredible brilliance of the diversity of perspectives that we say we want. And I have seen in the people that I work with. And that's not going to fix the problem, because we're asking individual people to change small things around the edges when we have major systemic issues that are keeping us from seeing leaders of color succeed.
Yeah, I think that you're raising such an important point, because not only does a leader of color come in and face real headwinds that a white leader does not face, they also are often being brought in to sort of, for lack of a better term, clean up a mess that a bunch of white people have made, and that is really, and then they get resented when they do the thing they've just been hired to do. And we've seen this. Certainly, I've seen it in the for-profit companies, but I've also seen it in a number of schools happen, and it's enraging, frankly.
I think the term is glass cliff is what they call it when you bring in a person of color to kind of clean up a mess, because they are on the edge as soon as they start. And any misstep and they're gone, and they tumble down. So yeah, I see it all the time too, and it's very, very scary. And it's like we're out of options. It feels like when they get to the person that decides to appoint someone who is a person of color to the executive position, and they say we're okay with letting this person fail or succeed, and it's just going to be a toss up. And then that feeling is just feels like it just takes my breath away just to think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the trends that I call out, because I think some of this is us, all of us, and I should I identify as an Indian American woman. I find myself in an in-between. There are places where I identify as a person of color, and there are places where I'm on the very privileged side in terms of how people see me and what they expect of me. But the phenomenon that I speak to my role as a person who has influence on the systems. I think we need to name the things that are happening explicitly. And the point you're making, Kim and Wesley, is around the less social capital and financial capital, all of those things that leaders of color often have. They can't say that they inherited a struggling organization from a white leader. Who is going to believe them in the current context? They don't have the network, the belief, the faith to fail. They can't be the Black women or the Latino man that failed at leading after a successful white leader, again, because of those positive expectations. And it's really challenging because you see how the system is reinforcing itself.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm going to do a talk at the NAIS, which is the National Association of Independent Schools. And I was talking to a bunch of people there, and there's this trend that's very disturbing in independent schools, which is these schools have sort of in 2020, 2021, often hired very senior Black leaders, and now they heads of school, and now boards of directors are firing those heads of school without a lot of due process. And so I think one of the systemic problems that we face, not only in schools, but also in boards of directors everywhere, is like the part of the board of directors' job is to hold the CEO accountable. But who is holding the board of directors accountable? Because often the board of directors is the most privileged group in the organization. So what are your thoughts on what are the things we can do to change to hold boards of directors accountable for making decisions that may be really unjust?
So many thoughts. To start, I would say I took so much from Radical Candor and radical respect around how much a good leader can influence an organization. I think the challenge you were flagging, and I think a lot of what I wrote about, what I see in my work coaching CEOs, is what happens when the boss is the one who is experiencing bias, prejudice, and doesn't have
Yes.
the respect for what they bring. I think
Yes.
it's a lot more complicated, realistically. A couple of thoughts. One, all of what you are describing, I see in the education space as well.
Yeah.
One, I think requirements around how boards are actually trained on equity and understanding
Yes.
equity. Many people who have the time, the wealth to be on a board may not ever have shared a lived experience with the leader that they are supporting.
Yes.
um, Having some diversity in that board of directors, I think often you can shift that dynamic by actually having someone who may share lived experience and can help the rest of the board understand that, though it certainly shouldn't be their burden alone to carry.
Yeah.
But it sure is, it sure helps to have someone that understands what that leader is going through.
Yes.
I heard that
And
you can't just have one. That
yeah.
if you have to have multiple, because if it's just one, they are still marginalized in those groups, in those areas, in those rooms, and when those discussions happen, or they're seen as someone who's going to just disharmonizing the group if they are bringing up issues that they feel are valid. But having someone else that can also validate or contrast or even rearrange the words so that it hits different is something that's highly advantageous for groups like that. So I totally agree with you. We need more diversity in boards and people in the room.
I think another issue that you're touching on, Shalini, is this problem. Like in Radical Respect, I talk about the different roles that we play. And, you can be the leader. And when you're the leader and the person who is on the receiving end of disrespect at the same time, that's really tricky. That's a really tricky situation. I am a white woman, so definitely not a leader of color, but I as a woman, have experienced this many times. Like there was one time, and I tell this story in the book, where I had an employee who was not performing very well, and I was talking to him. I was giving him some feedback, and I ended the conversation by asking him, as I always try to do in such a situation, what could I do or stop doing that would help you get this back on track? And he leans in and he says, the problem here is you are the most aggressive woman I ever met. And, if I'm the most aggressive woman he ever met, I'm not even on the list of the top 100 most aggressive men. And we were in an aggressive industry, and his job was to deal with aggressive people. And so his problem was not my aggression, his problem was my gender. And in my case, that was not going to change. But I also, at the same time, and this is why it's tricky, like the sort of naming the different. So as a woman, I had less power in some ways than he did in the situation. But as the CEO of the company and his boss, I had more power. and so it was very focused on making sure that he felt free to give me feedback, even if I felt the feedback. And I optimized for that. And I did not give him the feedback on the way that he was trying to use gender to push back on the feedback I was giving him. And the problem with that, with my deciding not to confront him, was that if he was going to talk to me that way, how was he going to talk to other women at the company? And I soon had an opportunity to find out. We were having a company meeting, and we had pizza, and there was a woman who worked for him, actually was sitting on a table, and underneath the table was the garbage can. And he walks up to her with his plate with crusts of pizza. And she said, do you need? And she was going to say to get to the garbage can. And he says, I need to get in between your legs. And, like totally unacceptable, you know. And yet it was tricky, again, what I needed to do in that moment was set aside my my identity as a woman who was offended by that and behave like a leader, which is to create consequences for him. But it's hard. It's harder. It's harder when you're having to, at the same time, create an environment where people can push back on you and let them know, what's acceptable and what's not. When you feel like you're the leader and the person harmed at the same time, it's tricky, I guess. It's what I'm trying to say.
No, completely. Well, I think I'll name two things I hear from that example. One is there is a lot that plays out. You can have a leader of color who is repeating these behaviors that diminish other leaders in their organization. And so, one, just naming that when a leader experiences something, it often is connected to a lot of what happens through the rest of the organization. And so they are not immune from experiencing it or passing it on. I do think there are choices. You're naming a choice to interrupt it versus repeat that behavior.
Yes.
I do think a lot of the same pressures can cause leaders to sometimes repeat bad behavior. I think the second thing to think about is really, what is the difference between hearing you're aggressive once in your career and at a point when you're more senior versus hearing it over and over and over again, and from people in positions of so-called greater power or authority or what have you.
Or just the majority.
Yeah. And I think that what I see a lot and am really coming to appreciate is that, and there's research on this too, is that what happens with leaders of color when they are told over and over again that they are not enough, they are not strategic, they are not smart, is that they develop an appropriate self-protective response. It's a trauma response of not trying, not taking risks, not putting themselves out there. They never learn to develop and fully flourish and actually take those risks around leading as they authentically are. And so I would say, like, that's the piece to think about when leaders get feedback like that. Like, I got feedback earlier in my career that really stung and impacted me. Somebody could say the same thing to me now, and whatever.
Yeah. There's so what you're saying. There's a few different things. One is that there's this sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts kind of aspect to this kind of repeated bias that people experience, and sometimes what can happen is you've heard it over and over and over again. You've been silent, and finally one day you haven't had breakfast, and then you respond as though you respond for the last 50 times this has happened, and not just that one time. And the person who said the thing the one time is like, "Oh, you're overreacting," but you're not overreacting. But so part of this is like an education of white leaders who bring in people, or white board members, for example, who bring in a leader of color. Like, you may think this was just a little thing, but when it happens, the same thing happens over and over and over and over again. It's like a repetitive stress injury.
Yes. Yeah. And I think for a lot of folks, understanding this happens to people not only in their professional lives, but in their day-to-day personal lives as well.
Yeah, just going to the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, for groups that don't know to seek out this information, right? So they're not proactively doing the things that they need to do to make sure that they're supporting their leaders that they've hired, to make sure that they're successful. How do we get the message to them? How do they know to ask? How do they get educated or know to get educated about this issue?
Sure. I mean, one, it's why I'm having this conversation, why I wrote this piece. I think it's the obligation of those of us with the privilege of our identity, our pedigrees, the networks that we have, to tell other people. I have many connections that are funders. I am having this conversation constantly. I am elevating what it looks like to be a leader that might be different than what we've celebrated. And it's my job to interrupt. And I think that makes me think about your story as well, Kim. I wonder if you should have had to be the person to tell this person that actually the way they are thinking about aggression in men and women, it just doesn't make any sense and is incredibly biased. Whose job is that in a position of relative safety and privilege, and who can actually influence this person to tell them that?
Yeah. I mean, I think in this case, it probably was, but I mean, I was the founder and CEO. So I guess I could have turned to a board member but I could have spoken up, also
Mhm.
in this case. But I think you're raising a really important point, which is that, for example, if my board had come to me and given me feedback that felt gendered, that would be, I would expect my board to have educated itself. So you raised a really good point about risk taking. And I think one of the many ways that privilege compounds is that if you're white, it's much safer to take risks than if you're not white. And those risks pay off richly, and that's like, so over the course of a career, the fact that it's not, and then, so if you're a board member and you've hired a Black leader for your organization, don't go telling them you're not taking enough risks. Like, how can we make it safe for you to take risks, for example? Sort of
Yes.
being aware of these biases that it's like telling a woman, oh, the problem is you're not a good negotiator. That's not the problem. The problem is I, as a woman, get punished for negotiating as hard as the men around me negotiate. And so it's not that I'm not a good negotiator, I'm a rational actor. But, other examples of that, those kinds of
Yes.
biases that turn in feedback bias masquerading as feedback.
I mean, I think one of my least favorite examples is when people tell me that a leader of color is not strategic.
Mm-hmm.
What they actually mean is that leader did not give them the strategy in a PowerPoint document, which is the only way that they can interpret it. I have never met a leader of color who isn't an incredibly astute, very thoughtful, creative problem solver, which I have done a lot of strategy for some very well-known organizations. That is the essence of strategy. And I think what you just named in that example, creating safe space, allowing people to have other ways. Ask a leader, what is your big, bold vision for this organization? If it is in PowerPoint that people can receive it, make that expectation explicit. And you can teach that. It is not rocket science.
No.
But I often find there is this person can't do this thing in this exact way. And that means that they can't be a leader because they're missing this huge skill. I think the other thing I hear is the absence of context. The example that you gave around Black leaders or leaders of color being asked to clean up a mess, there was not safety for that leader to raise that and name that they had been left a mess of an organization by a white founder. I have been in rooms where I have heard folks say this leader is struggling because their organization is struggling, and actually been able to lend my social capital to say, no, I have context and I can vouch for the fact that this person actually inherited a struggling organization.
Yeah.
And that actually makes them a good leader because they are making some real improvements and shifts. And so I think those are strategies. The other thing I would say is when you are encouraging people to show up as they are, giving them lots of encouragement to continue to show up as they are, because that's necessary to trump the, many, many times in their personal and professional life, they have been told that how they are is not enough.
Yeah.
I just want to chime in just here, just because this is what you said really resonated with me, being called not strategic enough. And I think no matter who you are, if you're a decision maker, you're balancing some things that are optimal and suboptimal. You're choosing where to move the needle to figure out what impact, and there's always trade-offs, right? So a lot of times that I've seen, at least I've experienced, where that people who don't recognize, or they know there's an issue, but they don't know how there's an issue. They don't recognize the pattern of how that issue came about, that they see the trade-offs and they don't recognize the positive sides of the trade-off. They only point out the downsides and not the positive sides because they were blind before, and they stay blind when someone else who sees it clearly and makes the right trade-offs to kind of recover from that nosedive. And they said, well, it just doesn't make sense to us. And because of this new perspective that they don't recognize, because they understand the person who's a leader has different experience, or they're drawing from different professional backgrounds or even personal backgrounds in order to concoct this comeback story that they're in charge of, that the leadership could say, well, we don't really understand how you got there or how this is going to work out. And some of the worst part of it is that I've seen as well is when you get a person that is able to right the ship, that's able to like stabilize the chaos. And then leadership says, okay, it's in a good shape now. Let's take you out of there and let's put someone else in that we believe in, that we think can take it from here. And I've seen that in several organizations as well.
Yeah, that's a horrible thing. And you should be rewarded for having stabilized the situation. I think also what happens, what I have seen recently happen in a couple of schools and also in some of the companies that I've worked with, is there deeply troubling things are being said in the organization. Just racist things are being said in the organization. And there's some sense that this is happening. And then these organizations, they bring in a person of color to help them fix it. And when this person of color points out this was said and it's not okay, everybody gets mad at them for doing what they were just hired to do, and is like, you're making us uncomfortable. I mean, it's like such an absurd you can't believe that this ever happens, and yet it happens over and over and over again. Such a pattern, and it makes me want to scream. And yet, when I have tried, I've been in a couple situations where I have just been. Denial is such a profound. I think that Freud got it wrong. His analysis of Oedipus Rex, the play, is incorrect. It's not about men wanting to sleep with their mothers and murder their fathers. What it's about is someone who did something wrong, and when he's confronted with his wrongdoing, he gouges his eyes out. And I feel like, I mean, that's kind of a violent metaphor, but I feel like that is what's happening with this DEI backlash, and what's happening to a lot of wonderful, in particular, Black leaders in both schools and companies.
It's so much there. I mean, I think this work is really hard and uncomfortable. Some of the work and some of the spaces that I get to be in, I'm honestly a more comfortable person of color to say some of these things. Mm-hmm. And it is less risk and cost to me, though it is not at no cost.
Yes.
But it's certainly less risk and cost to me to say these things than what would be true of another person who faces this from every direction on every aspect of their lives.
Yes.
I think the gouging your eyes out is such a very visceral
metaphor.
But I think the reason that I do this work is what the research bears out is we are losing out on outcomes of the work that these organizations are trying to do and what we as a society aspire to. We name it when we say we should diversify representation in our leadership ranks because there's all this research. But it's so hard we give up. Mm-hmm. And leaders of color leave because why should they have to bear the tax of us being uncomfortable for a long time? Yeah. And then the organizations lose out. They lose out on so many things that these incredible leaders that I know, also when you read, all of the data on this, motivation, really critical problem solving, some of the toughest and most entrenched problems, the people leadership skills that are critical to leadership. And quite frankly, you can't learn in business school. There's so many assets that organizations get that could help them achieve their goals, and we are losing that, which I think is really what it does continue to motivate me. It's also what often can land with organizations or with people who aren't where we may be in this conversation.
Yeah. So, yes to all of that. So, I want we're getting close to time, but I want to leave folks with some very practical, tactical tips. Like, it's one thing to say we need systemic change. Like, what are the things that board members who have hired excellent people of color to lead their organizations, what are the things they can do to address the systemic problems that these leaders are facing? One thing is to make sure that you're putting a check on your own power and educating yourself about the situation that these leaders are in. But what are some of your what are some of your tactics in order to change the system?
Sure. Certainly making sure folks have any training, and in particular on the job support. There's a fair amount of research in the nonprofit space that leaders of color get less on the job support. So mentors, coaching on the job, a former leader in that space, sharing your capital, right? Bringing in funders and vouching for this person, boosting them on your social media, to your friends, to other board members when you have perspectives on them. Giving lots of encouragement to that leader to show up as they are. Being clear, we talked about this earlier, being clear about where there are certain skills, behaviors, formats that are expected, but really leaning into what is this leader's genius and how can you best
unleash
see that
it
in order to benefit from it as an organization. And then last, I would say, and I think this really gets to the conversation we had before about the repeated trauma, making sure that that leader has access to mentors, a community. What that does is it helps that person know they are not alone. There is nothing wrong with them. It is a systems problem. It happened. I run a cohort in DC that is for CEOs of nonprofits. My last cohort were all Black leaders. Nothing was wrong with any of them. What they got to see was that every leader was experiencing a systemic failure to appreciate Black leaders, and they no longer had to hold it alone. And they could make choices and find agency around how they wanted to move through it individually and as a group, which is how you move through and recover from trauma. You actually find your way again. You find your way in spite of the obstacles. And so I think that is a critical thing that organizations, boards, funders can do, is make sure that for how much you are asking of this leader, you're actually giving them that cushion, that safety, that support to show up as themselves in a system that's still working to change.
Yeah. And what can board members do? Who would you recommend? Like, if you're advising a board, I know there's several groups that seem really great that I've heard about. If you wanted to hire someone to come in and to say, what do we need to know as a board member in order to best support this leader? Are there, like, I know there's the Glasgow group, there's Leverage to Lead. Are there other organizations that can come in? Because I think that one of the things that, in particular, white board members need to do is they need to educate themselves. They don't need to demand that, they need to figure out what are the biased things that I'm going to go in and say, and they need to learn that ignorance is no excuse.
I know
they could hire you. They could hire you.
I mean, I do. I work with several white leaders. I serve on several boards that are really have approached me asking how they can show up in different ways. And so I tell them not always how they're behaving, but the patterns that I see. They're real patterns, and how more privileged leaders show up and how it shuts down other folks in their atmosphere. started this work with a little organization called the Equity Lab. It does a lot of work in the education space, in the nonprofit space, and in the philanthropy space. It's really about the muscles around having the conversation about race in particular, and knowing other humans as humans, which I think is such a huge piece of what you talked about in Radical Respect and Radical Candor. Just
both.
Humans. How do you actually see humans and their beauty and brilliance and amazingness beyond all of these stereotypes that we have been taught as a society?
Yes.
I did forget one last tip, practical tip that you asked for.
Excellent.
Have conversations with people about joy, what they want. I think we often
that's awesome.
see leaders of color, particularly in mission-driven work, staying with the work for the service to the community. But when you look at the bigger need for change in our society, we want leaders of color to be happy, to be healthy, to build generational wealth. Because that's how they become the folks that lead the systems and really push us to change.
Yes. That's like, I'm hearing like joy is a form of protest in some ways sometimes. And I really love the tip also about not just mentorship, but sponsorship and making sure that people are cheering the people when they're not in the room and making sure that they do the work to make sure that they get highlighted and get the support. So I really, really appreciate that. Before we wrap up, could you share, if people do want to get in contact with you, where they can find you and your work?
Sure. The easiest way is probably LinkedIn, and there's a link there to my website, and you can see more about the executive coaching work I do, the cohort that I run, and happy to partner with organizations in other ways as well.
So we'll put that in the show notes. Great. Shalini, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to speak with you. And for our listeners, hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please rate and review us wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Take care.
Thank you so much.